I had been wanting to do the story of La Llorona for quite some time, and I had intended to do some research on her and the stories behind her, but I just hadn't gotten around to it. And then one of our lovely listeners, Laura Diaz, was listening to one of my very first videos in which I had read a Reddit story, and the author of that Reddit story had mistakenly confused the woman in white with La Llorona. So Laura kindly corrected that, and I started talking to her about it, and she kindly offered to compile some research so that I could more easily do the La Llorona piece. So I agreed, and I expected that perhaps I would get a few resources, but Laura Diaz is wonderful and literally wrote the entire script for me. So yesterday, she sent that information to me, and yesterday my mom was in a car accident. The car is totaled, she's alright, but there would not have been a video today were it not for Laura. So I wanted to give a shout out to Laura Diaz, who spent her time to put this together, not knowing that anything had happened to my mom, but it just so happened that on the day that I would not have been able to do research or find stories to record anything new, this was provided. So I wanted to thank Laura very much for the time and effort that she put into this. There are instances of Spanish throughout, of course. I am rusty at best, so hopefully I don't say anything too incorrectly, but if I screw up the Spanish, do forgive me. But it's just too beautiful to not include, so I'm going to give it a go. But anyway, I just thought it was important to let you guys know how this video came to be, and the fact that we wouldn't have had one today had Laura not been so kind as to literally write it for me. So the remainder of this video was kindly provided by Laura Diaz. So thank you, lovely listener, for your assistance with this tale. Alright, and you'll also notice this is not currently a part of any, existing series, but I suppose we could do a Legends and Lore series as well, if you would like, because there's a lot of wonderful stories out there that I would love to tell. So, anyway, without further ado, since we're 3 minutes and 17 seconds into this, let's get on with it. So, get comfortable and grab some coffee or tea, settle in, and get ready to take another journey into the night. The legend of La Llorona is well known all around Latin America, from Mexico all the way down to Argentina. The versions vary from region to region, but the basic story is that La Llorona is the ghost of a woman who cries for her children. She is said to appear during nights of full moon close to bodies of water. The descriptions of her appearance also vary from region to region. Some say she wears a black, dirty dress and carries a dead baby in her arms, that she has a skull for a face, that instead of black, her dress is white, very dirty and ragged at the bottom from dragging it around. But she always screams, "Ay, mis hijos," which is translated, "Ay, my children," or "Donde están mis hijos?" Where are my children? One of the versions of her story is that she was a poor, beautiful young woman that immigrated to the city, where she was hired to work at the house of a rich family. She fell in love with the son of the family, but after she got pregnant by him, she was fired. Her family was very religious and were very obvious with their rejection against her pregnancy. The night she gave birth, she went to a river and threw her baby in, but regretted it immediately and swam after him. Both drowned. In the second version, she was married to a man for many years and had 2 children with him. One day, he leaves her for a younger, more beautiful woman. She loses her mind over it and drowns her children as revenge, to only then drown herself. In the third version, she was close to the river with her child, and when she wasn't paying attention, her child drowned. Due to guilt, she drowned herself. In the fourth version, she was the wife of a captain during the Colombian Civil War, but her husband left her to pursue the war. She was told that her husband had died, and she fell in love with another soldier, who also eventually left for the war, but she got pregnant. When she gave birth, a group of soldiers came into town and her neighbor told her that her husband was amongst them. She left with the baby during a storm and drowned alongside the baby when she fell into the river. In the fifth tale, she was an older woman that had married a younger man. She had 3 children with him. One night, the man was drunk and punched her. In a rage, she killed him and then drowned her 3 children. But when she came to her senses and realized what she had done, she also drowned herself. In the sixth version, she was jealous of her 2 children because her husband spent all of his time with them. She drowned them in a close river, and when her husband found out, he killed her. And finally, the seventh version. She married the devil without knowing who he was. One day he came home early and the food wasn't prepared. She left to go get some food, but the devil was too hungry, so he killed and ate the children. When she came back, she wouldn't stop crying, so he killed her too. The legend of La Llorona is one of the oldest tales in Latin America, coming from the times of the colony. However, there's a book entitled Visión de los Vencidos, Vision of the Vanquished, by Miguel León Portilla. It's a chronic based on indigenous writings that narrate events during the conquest of Mexico. One of the chapters centers around the omens claimed to be seen by the Mexica people, specifically by the leader of Tenochtitlan. These omens foresaw the coming of the Spanish conquerors 10 years before they came. The sixth one reads as follows. Sexto presagio funesto. Muchas veces se oía. Una mujer lloraba, iba gritando por la noche. Andaba dando grandes gritos. Hijitos míos, pues ya tenemos que irnos lejos. Y a veces decía, hijitos míos, ¿a dónde os llevaré? The translation of this is sixth fateful omen. Very often it was heard, a woman crying. She would scream at night, roaming at night with mighty screams. My children, we must go far. And she would sometimes say, my children, where shall I take you? The Mexica people thought this woman to be Cihuacoatl, who in the Mexica mythology was the reaper of souls and protector of women that died at childbirth. She is thought to be one of the precedents for the legend of La Llorona. Now, I did want to see if there were some stories on Reddit from people who had come in contact with La Llorona, and I was able to find some. Here are a few of the stories. My dad was a freshman in high school during the time. He was active in sports and it was football season. Back in that day, he said he would have to walk to and from school, and they used to use what they called the Stinky Tunnel to transport because it eliminated the risk of crossing over the train tracks. This tunnel was approximately 50 yards. A lot of homeless people and drug users would stay in the tunnel overnight for some kind of warmth or cover from the winter and autumn nights. One day, my dad went to school as usual, then had football practice afterward. They were getting ready to play a big game, so practice lasted a while. It was around 7 o'clock at night when he finally got out and headed home. The walk back home was approximately 372 feet. He got to the Stinky Tunnel, but decided not to use it because there were already people in it. He decided that he would walk across the track instead. He said that he had just crossed the track when he heard the loudest crying, very emotional, like something was very wrong. He looked everywhere to see where it was coming from, but to no avail since it was dark. Only the far streetlights were barely illuminating the dirt around him. He started to walk faster. The crying followed. My dad's arm hair stood up on end and he started to get goosebumps. Then he started to speed walk, but the crying increased in strength and volume. At this point, my dad began to run, but he was already tired from practice, so he wasn't running very fast. But the faster he ran, he said the closer the crying got. Too terrified to turn around, he ran as fast as he could and dared not look back. He said the crying followed him all the way home, and the last thing that La Llorona said was, "Mis hijos." He got inside and collapsed on the floor into tears. My grandmother ran to him to see what was wrong, but he didn't say a word of what happened. He simply got up and went to his room. He actually had to take a break telling me the story, saying that it took a lot out of him. He's a big skeptic, and this is one thing that he hates talking about. My mom was 10 years old and lived next to a small ditch, which was next to a highway. One night she stayed at her friend's house, which was a little closer to the ditch. The day went normal, riding bikes, playing, typical girl stuff. Then night came, and they knew it was time to get home when the streetlights came on. They were sitting in her friend's bedroom, radio on, listening to some music and playing a card game. It was already dark out, and the music from the stereo filled the room. Now, my mom's friend lived with her mom and grandma, who both spoke fluent Spanish. My mom could understand it, but she couldn't speak it. My mom developed this overwhelming sense of anxiety and terror, and then it started, the crying. The girls both heard it, but brushed it off as a cat or a drunken neighbor. But soon the crying began to become louder and more obnoxious, like it wanted to be heard. The girls paused what they were doing, staring at the window. Once they looked that way, the crying became ear-splitting, so loud that it resonated over the stereo. Both girls had their hands over their ears, fearful of what was happening. The grandma burst into the room, holy water in one hand and a rosary in the other. She was screaming over the crying, praying in Spanish. My mom says that when she did this, the radio started to static and the lights began to flicker. Both the crying and the praying became extremely loud until finally, quiet. It all stopped. The grandma said a prayer over my room and her granddaughter and made them go into the living room, instructing them not to return to that room for the night and not to look out the window. My mom returned home in the morning, never speaking of what had happened. Not until later. Even when she tells the story now, an overwhelming sense of fear takes over her, and she gets goosebumps. It was during the summer when my family decided that we should all take a trip to Mexico to visit family. I was about to join the Marine Corps, so my mother wanted for me to go see my family just in case something bad happened. At the time, I was with my girlfriend, who was pregnant, and she would later become my wife and then my ex-wife. Since she was pregnant, I didn't want to leave her alone, so I bought her a ticket so she could come with me as well. She, being Caucasian with blonde hair and hazel eyes, made everyone around my grandma's house curious, and a lot of our extended family came by to see the beautiful American girl. After greeting everyone, we all started to talk about what had been going on since we left. My girlfriend was sitting next to me, having me translate parts of the conversation. One of my aunts, who knew that I was into the paranormal, brought up the subject of La Llorona. My mom quickly told my aunt to shut up, since she knew that it would get me both interested and scared regarding it, but I was able to push my aunt to keep on going. I mean, I was going to be in the Marines after all, I couldn't let a silly myth scare me. She proceeded to tell us about how whenever she would sleep over at my grandma's house, which is where my now ex-wife and I were currently going to stay, if she stayed up late enough, she would be able to hear the wails of La Llorona. My mom rolled her eyes and jokingly pushed my aunt. The subject died from there since one of the other aunts started talking about her son and whatnot. Seeing as how serious everyone had gotten for a brief moment, my girlfriend nudged me and asked what we were talking about. I told her the myth of La Llorona, about how she drowned her children in a river, one of the many renditions, and was destined to walk along all the rivers of Mexico looking for her dead children. She, of course, laughed, not really buying any of my paranormal stories. That night, my parents decided that my girlfriend and I should stay at our old house where I had grown up, since we were both adults and needed our own space. The house was currently being worked on, so the bedrooms had no doors or working lights. The only doors the house had were the ones that led into the house. They were fairly new, but they were your standard metal flimsy doors that a kick or a punch could make rattle throughout the house. Inside, we had to use a candle and a flashlight for our light source. I remember that we even used a bedsheet as a temporary door to give our room a little bit more privacy, even though it was just the two of us in the house. As the night went on, my girlfriend and I stayed up talking, and eventually we both fell asleep. I don't know at what time exactly, but something woke me up. I didn't have a cell phone, and my watch at the time was really cheap, so I wasn't able to tell what time it was. Looking down, I realized that my girlfriend had stolen the covers, so I slowly tried to steal some back. As I was debating on closing the window that was located right above our heads, I heard a long wail. It was a long, distorted wail, and I could hear the old raspiness in her voice, as if she'd been yelling for such a long time that her throat was getting ready to give out. But what confused me was that her wail sounded as if it was being played through an old gramophone. I don't know if it was the scratchiness of her voice or what exactly, but it sounded like an old creepy record playing over and over. She was wailing her trademark, "Ay, mis hijos," or "Oh, my children." That wail was what made her infamous, not just in the paranormal community, but with most people living in rural parts of Mexico. My girlfriend started to stir and woke up. I don't remember if I woke her up on purpose, but either way, it was a dick move of me to do, since she would now also get to hear the wails. I was both excited and scared shitless at the same time. A cold chill traveling down my spine just reinforced my fear. The wails grew louder, making it seem like she was slowly heading towards us. As a side note, there's a myth that if you hear the wails close by, she's actually far away, but if you hear them far, she might be somewhere near you. My girlfriend asked me with a half smile, "What the hell is that?" thinking I had just asked my aunts to come scare us. I just motioned for her to be quiet and to listen, and hearing the tone of my voice, she knew that something was wrong. Another loud wail passed by, echoing inside the house. My girlfriend started shaking, terrified of what could be outside. I had my left arm under her head and I could feel tears run down from her face onto my arm. Each time the wail came, she would shake a little, and at the same time I would hold her close. The wails eventually came to a peak, where it sounded as if she was outside our window. Doing the only brave thing I knew, I pulled the covers over us and tried to remain as still as we could. The wails eventually faded out, and just as we thought that she had gone, we heard two wild dogs viciously fighting and slamming against our outside door. My girlfriend had grown attached to this stray dog that used to walk around my grandma's farm, so while we were staying there, he would always sleep on the outside door and wait for us to greet him in the morning. The dogs, or at least what we thought were dogs, fought for a good minute, slamming against the door, snarling and barking. Then, as sudden as the fight started, it stopped. We attempted to stay up for a while longer to see if we heard anything else, but eventually sleep took over us. The following morning, we talked about what had happened. We walked outside to meet our stray dog, but he was gone. All that was left was stirred up dirt from the fight that had happened the night before. We never got to see that dog the rest of the trip. He would usually come around, but we just told ourselves that maybe he found a place with better owners who could feed him better. This all happened around 2008, and it still goes on today. Whenever I pick up my daughter, I ask my ex about what happened in Mexico, but she doesn't like to talk about it. I haven't been to Mexico ever since. I had an encounter with La Llorona when I was about 3 or 4, back in Mexico, somewhere near Pachuca, Hidalgo. I recall my mom and I going to a family outing or picnic out in the woods. The adults were talking amongst themselves, and since I was the only child there and bored, I decided to explore the area. Nearby was a river, and I decided to look at the wildlife, pick up rocks, etc. From a distance, I see a big boulder, so naturally I decide to walk toward it to climb it. When I get near, however, I see a white silhouette, a misty figure in the form of a young lady, with long hair, sitting on top of the rock. Apparently my thought process was that the farther away someone is, the more transparent they become. She had her hands to her face, as if she was brushing off some tears, and seemed to be sniffling. I could faintly hear her crying and saying something, but I couldn't make out what it was. The lady was facing away from me and didn't seem to be noticing me, so I walked closer to see if she needed help. I thought that maybe she had climbed the rock by herself and needed help getting down. So I called out, "Do you need help?" in Spanish, but she didn't respond. I was going to call out again, but then I hear my mom calling for me, so I turn around and I see my mom signaling for me to get back with the rest of the group. And when I looked back at the boulder, the woman was gone. I asked my mom if she saw someone on the rock, and she said no. I told her I thought I saw someone, but didn't pursue it any further because the woman was gone. A few years later, I'm swapping stories with friends, and we're talking about urban myths and spooky stories, and they mentioned the urban myth of La Llorona, and how an uncle saw La Llorona when he was young. I asked more about the myth, and that's when I realized that what I saw when I was in Mexico was the exact same phenomenon. It gave me chills. When I was younger, my mother would tell me stories and cautionary tales that my abuela, her mother, would tell her. I always regarded them as old wives' tales and stories to keep kids out of harm, so I never really thought that much about them. Fast forward to 2011. My parents divorced, and my dad and I moved to a cabin in the woods 10 miles east of where I grew up, landing me within walking distance of the lake of the area. I grew up around this lake, so I had no discomfort in walking around at night. The town we moved to, I now believe, is a vortex. There's really no other way for me to describe it. It's just a vortex, and nothing good can come from it. Anyways, I'm walking around the lake about a month and a half after we moved in. It was late July, around 11:30 p.m. It was 80 degrees with a slight breeze, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky blocking my view of the stars. It was awesome. About 15 minutes into my walk, I hear a woman crying. There are people camping all over the lake, so I figure one woman is just having a bad night. It's off-putting, but I keep walking. I hear her again, and she sounds closer. I realize that she's crying out, and after sitting still, I can make out, "Ay, mis hijos," or "Oh, my children." I look around, and sure enough, I see a woman kneeling at the water's edge about 100 feet further along the bank, crying. She looks at me and starts to get up, and I ran as fast as I could back home. I get home, lock the doors, turn on the lights, shut all the blinds, and hide in my room until sunup. I haven't gone to the lake since that day, or night. We've since moved out of town after begging and pleading with my dad. Too much weird shit happened there for my own liking. unlike some other creatures and legends and stories that I've looked up, there really aren't that many stories on Reddit about La Llorona, which is kind of interesting, because there's no shortage of information and personal stories on anything when it comes to Reddit. There are some stories like the ones I've read, and there are some videos on YouTube that claim to show footage of La Llorona, some more convincing than others. It's interesting to me that for such a widely known story, there really aren't too many stories around to find. There's myth and legend and speculation. The interesting thing about La Llorona is that she seems to be somewhat universal. While she should not be confused with the standard woman in white, there are stories of weeping women searching for their children endlessly throughout the world, even into Puerto Rico and Italy. In fact, in almost every culture, you can find a story about a woman who searches endlessly for her lost children. I don't think that makes La Llorona any less true, but perhaps it makes the presence of these spirits, or whatever they are, all the more interesting. Why is it that we all have our own version of La Llorona? Is it something that we've collectively created? Some personification of the fear of the worst thing that could happen? Losing a child? Or is it just that this happens so often that every culture has their own? Regardless, I think the discussion surrounding La Llorona and similar spirits is fascinating and endless. But for now, I'll leave you with the stories and the history, and I'll let you make your own decision. I hope you all enjoyed this tale, and especially the lovely history that was put together and written so wonderfully by Laura Diaz. Thank you again, Laura, for the time and effort that you put into that. It was a great help in having a video today at all. I do apologize if there were some crows that were going crazy at the beginning of that, so hopefully it wasn't too distracting, but I had to record this a little later than I usually do, and the world is a little bit more alive, so there are more, sounds that interrupt. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments, or you can vote in the poll, which entity or legend or lore you would like me to look at next. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, or whenever it is you're watching this. If you're new here, won't you consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell? That way, you will be an official member of the Conspiracy of Ravens, an official lovely listener, and you'll never miss an upload. If you liked this video, hit like, and in the comments, leave a thank you for Laura. We would not have had a video today, like I said before, had it not been for her work, so